Welcome back to another episode of the Tell Me Brideson Show. I want to talk and discuss different concepts around training in terms of planning and how to get the most out of your training sessions. Now, when we look at training from a programming standpoint, really, if you simplify things down, there's two separate things that we can use as a main driver of volume. And the first one is intensity. So increasing the weight that you put on the bar in order to push the neurological side of things and push up your strength. The other one is just driving volume as a main driver of your adaptation. So increasing sets and reps, increasing the amount of work that you do so that you can essentially build more muscle mass and build more density into your training. Now, as coaches, we use a term called periodization where we plan out, a big picture of what your training will look like from, your point A to your point B. We break it into small manageable chunks and we like to label it as different phases of training. Commonly it's heard as, accumulation phases or hypertrophy phases where you're kind of building the volume, intensification phases or a strength phase where you're building that strength density and, getting a bit more neural drive into your training. And then either a realization or a peaking phase where you express either your strength, your power, or whatever it is that you're working towards. So if I've spent a lot of time in the weeds with this, and I think, anyone that's been coaching for a really long time is really passionate about, building out coaching systems and systems that you can get repeatable results with. And that leads in today. And I really think that the simplification of it is, do you use volume as a driver or do you use intensity? And it doesn't matter whether you're training for strength or for hypertrophy, there really are the two key attributes that you use. Now, I've been having some very interesting conversations with a few of my coaching clients, and at different phases through the year, it makes sense to use different adaptations. Now, if you've got someone that is purely training for body composition, building muscle mass, and a lifestyle approach, and the only outcome that you really are focusing on is continuing to train well, continuing to train hard, and building muscle mass, you may use a bit of a flipped approach where you start off on a strength block to consolidate, how strong you are and your ability to actually do work. And then you might move into the latter or the back end of that particular plan, building volume and adding more and more volume into your training. So you might use different, training techniques. You might use different methods like a myo set or something that really condenses volume into a small period of time, which allows you to essentially do more work. So you might start off with strength and then really progress that into a huge amount of volume because you're really chasing that hypertrophy sort of adaptation. In a strength world, and if you're training for powerlifting, for instance, it's typical that you start off with your training programs where at the start, you're training more training volume. So you're doing a lot more sets and reps. The overall weight is a lot lower. You're working on technique and conditioning and capacity. And then as you phase into more of the strength phases, it's when you start to bring the weight up. But, the inverse side of that is you start to drop off some sets as well. And then you get to a point where you express that as a 1 RM, 2 RM, 3 RM, or whatever it is that you're working towards, right? So when you look at it like that, that is a very logical way of looking at training, right? When you're trying to build muscle mass, you build volume. When you're trying to build strength, you increase the intensity. Now, if we kind of simplify that even further, if you've been training for 5 years and your only outcome is, that you're chasing is strength, then you actually probably can simplify that down even further. And you can go, okay, well, there's periods of time where I'm doing work, I'm doing volume. And in those periods, I'm working on technique, I'm bringing up weak point areas, I'm working on functional stability and, balance throughout the entire body. But the other side of that is in those phases, you don't want the training intensity to be too high. You want to be getting that main stimulation from actually the sets and reps. So in those phases, when say you're doing 6 to 8 sets of a particular exercise, the RPE or the intensity that you're working at is really rarely ever going to exceed 80% or an 8 RPE because you get the density and you get the bread and butter of your training in the sets and reps. That's where the fatigue comes from. So, anyone that's done any interval training is a perfect example, any sort of aerobic based training, if you've got 10 repeat efforts of, 30-second sprints, for instance, the first 1, 2, 3, 4 may be kind of pretty cruisy. The mid sets start to get a little bit hairy, but towards the back end of those intervals, 8, 9, and 10, you're really working. So it's the combined effort of the entire session that's hard. So in a volume block, it's not every single set is really, really on the pedal. It's a combination of the entirety of the set. So if you're doing 6 or 8 sets, by the time you're getting to that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 set, that's when it really starts to get dense. It starts to get hard, but that's where the adaptation comes in. So you're not pushing high as in weight, but you're actually continuing to get that stimulus through the volume. Whereas in a strength-based phase, you will be getting that adaptation from continuing to add weight to the bar. So, as the volume drops off, you have to, by default, drop some of that volume off because, I can't get you to do 6 sets of 5 reps at 90 or 95% or at a 9 RPE because I'm now working way too many sets at such a high threshold that there's going to be a point of diminishing return in the training results. So I'm going to, 1, not be able to complete the whole session at that intensity. 2, I'm going to expose myself to, my technique breaking down, the inability to maintain that position and actually do the lift in a safe and effective way. So there's the risk reward of that particular training method isn't there. So that's why we drop the training volume off when we're in a strength block, we drop the training volume off as we start to really ramp up that training intensity. So if we have a look at it and you simplify that, if you were training for muscle mass, you could do 2. Really, all you're doing is 2 key phases. You're doing building phases and then you're doing phases where you're working on intensity, but you can still work building phases for hypertrophy. And then you can also still use building phases for hypertrophy as well. So in the first block where you're using volume, you're using the amount of sets and reps that you're doing to get any stimulus. But then you can move that still chasing hypertrophy. But instead of doing, 6 to 8 sets of 8, you might only do 2 or 3 sets of 8 at a higher intensity and really start to push the weight up. But you have to, when you're looking at it, you have to realize that, if you're really pushing the intensity up, you have to by default bring the amount of work that you're doing down, or use a method where when you are pushing up the intensity, you are then also doing back off sets, which are at a much lighter weight. So when you look at like powerlifting training, for instance, you'll often find a really common technique that people use is a top set followed by some back off sets. And what that top set is, it's very neurological. It's more an expression of your strength on any particular day. So you come in and you do, a top double or top single, whatever it may be. And then you do back off sets at a lighter weight. And the reason we do that is because that isn't really developing the bread and butter of your strength or your muscle adaptation. All it's doing is saying, well, that's where my strength is at for this particular day. And then I'm going to do the working sets, which is where I actually get the stimulus and the adaptation. Now, don't get me wrong, doing the heavier sets in the training really do help because, you need to work on skill. You need to work on your refinement of how you hold position through these heavy sets. And like lifting heavy in itself is a skill. It's not something that you just rock up one day and figure out how to do. You have to do the sets and reps in it. But when you are lifting really, really heavy, there is a point of diminishing return. So, you want to get multiple exposure to it for longer periods of time, but you do that over blocks rather than just a steep increase in one training block. So when we're starting to look at, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And, when we start to look at all the different methods and all the different periodization models and, how you would plan out an ideal year, you can try and periodize a year as best as you possibly can. But the reality is the 2 main drivers are really volume and intensity. So that's really where the bread and butter comes from. And I think, as the years go on, the simpler you can get with your training programs, the more effective it is for you to actually continue to push forward and make progress. Because, if you're in a phase of building that you're not really going to be pushing that intensity way too hard, and you're just going to be coming in and getting some really honest and constructive sessions in, where in other phases, that you need to mentally switch it on because you're coming in, you're going to have to put on more weight on the bar. You're going to have to push that a little bit harder than you've ever pushed before, which is a really good thing. But, I think it's a really healthy way to think about it as well is you shouldn't be doing the same stimulus year round. You definitely need to leave a big enough of a runway to get the adaptation or the changes that you're trying to get out of your training. But the reality is, you're just going to cycle through those, particular phases over and over and over again. And each time you jump into those new phases, you may be 5 or 10% stronger, or, 5 or 10% bigger than what you were in previous phases. So then when you move into that phase again, your output can be so much more. You can get so much more out of the exercises. You can add more weight to the bar. You can do more sets because you've built the muscle mass and you've built the strength. So when we're looking at, training and powerlifting and building muscle mass, you can really get bogged down in the nuances of it. And in all honesty, it's really fun. It's really creative. And, you can pull up the latest research. You can, find the most up-to-date methods. And the reality is all of them really only drive 2 main principles when we're talking about muscle building and strength is volume and intensity. So when we simplify things down a little bit, it just makes that training process so much better. And from a coaching perspective, when you're speaking and you're talking to your clients, it's really easy to sort of let them in on the story, the journey that they're about to take on. Because, when you think about it, is when you've got a coaching client, the training and the effect that they're doing, that is really significant to them. Like they think about it during the day. They're telling their friends and family about it. It's a really important thing that they do in their life, and they put a lot of effort and time investment and resource towards it. So as a coach, if you can give them a better understanding of, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how long they're going to be in that particular phase for, it means that they're already sort of sold on the outcome because they know what they're working towards. And I find sometimes when you don't have that plan and people don't understand what they're doing with their particular training program, that's when, for lack of better words, motivation becomes an issue because they don't really understand the journey that they're on. But when you can break it down into a simple form of like, hey, these next 3 training phases, all we're doing is working on volume. We're keeping the intensity in this mid-range, and we're building. It's a really easy way to manage your own expectations of what your outcome's going to be and what you're trying to get out of training. And then we're going to go, all right, now it's time to flip the gear, and we're going to really start to ramp things up over the next 3 to 4 training blocks. It starts to then go, okay, well, I know now that I need to start thinking about, okay, well, how hard can I push? Can I add more weight to the bar? Things change, and, you get that little flip, mentally you get that little flip, all right, it's time to work a little bit. It's time to push a little bit harder than I previously have. Now, that's not only relevant to powerlifters. This is so relevant to anyone that's training because, if you do the same training stimulus all year round, one, it's boring as. 2, you need a change of stimulus to continue to push you forward. Now, I don't mean you need to change your training program every week, but there needs to be a change in stimulus from time to time, even if it's 1 or 2 blocks that interject the year to, refresh one mentally, but physically as well. So having phases where you are, even if you are solely dedicated to training for strength, even if you had 1 or 2 blocks in there that had a little bit more volume, a little less intensity, it's going to help to push you forward because it's mentally refreshing, but it also gives your body a break. And same is true for someone that's building for muscle mass. Yes, you may spend the majority of your time on, with exercises like leg presses, pendulum squats that are externally stabilized, so you can get, closer to your failure point. But there's so much merit in having periods of the year where you're doing stuff that, is challenging and getting your skill component of the lift working better. So you may year round use machines, but then you might have 1 to 2 blocks a year where you do some safety bar squats or you do some high bar squats where, it's mentally refreshing, but physically it's a change of stimulus as well. So, when we're looking at the training process itself, there's so many ways to skin a cat. And I think, as coaches, it's such a fun part of working with people, but the reality is 99% of people don't really care because they're just chasing their training outcome and they're trying to get towards their goals, right? So that's where we can simplify down the process a little bit for them and help them on their journey. Or if, you are working coach to coach or coach to practitioner, you can have some really cool conversations around it because really the stimulus is, we know what the stimulus is. It's simple. It's using volume or it's using intensity as a driver of an outcome that we're trying to get. And you're going to have periods of the year where you're pushing harder in volume, and you're going to have periods of the year where you're pushing harder intensity. And I think it's such a simple way to think about it. And, it's definitely moving into the new year for myself. I'm definitely going to be having more conversations with these people because, I think part of the training process and part of the long-term training process is actually understanding it. So once you've got your training wheels off and, you're really into it, it's part of your lifestyle and, it's something that you're never not going to do anymore. Understanding what the different chunks of time that you spend on during the year are and why you do them is so powerful because then it's like, of course, this part of the year, I'm going to be spending doing this, and this part of the year I'm going to be spending pushing my intensity up. And it, from a user end, but also from a coaching end, and it makes that relationship so much more cohesive and open and easy to communicate between one another. But that's it for me today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.